Well, let's take that fallout from today's hearing to both Washington and Kiev. In the US capital, Jonathan Katz is with the think tank, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and our correspondent in Ukraine, Nick Connolly. Good evening to you both. Jonathan, firstly to you, what struck you about the testimony today from Helena Ivanovich, the former US ambassador to Ukraine?
Well, first, I just want to say that I had an opportunity to work with Masha Ivanovich, and she's one of America's top diplomats. So there's deep disappointment in Washington on both sides of the aisle in her treatment. And today's hearing, where she again provided, I think, very telling testimony about an effort, to oust her, a shadow effort by the Trump administration to conduct policy that's not in the interest of the United States, but to further Donald Trump's own political agenda. And so I think the testimony today, particularly the moment where the chair of this committee, Adam Schiff, read out a tweet highlighting the president once again trying to intimidate Masha Ivanovich, to me really highlights the challenge that we have in Washington.
I want to pick up on some of that with Nick, because, Nick, the former envoy was branded bad news by the president, who discredited her work in Ukraine on Twitter. Is that an opinion that has been held in circles there where you are? Is there anything to back up those claims?
Well, Helena, Marie Ivanovich was very well respected here in Ukraine. She was someone who understands this country very well. She'd also been posted to Ukraine in a more junior role before becoming ambassador. She was outspoken in her criticism of failures to combat corruption on the part of the Ukrainian government. That didn't make her popular with everyone. But this was a through and through careful career diplomat, not someone in the style of, say, Trump's Berlin appointee Richard Grenell, a more flashy media persona. She was the consummate professional and someone who generally was very careful about what she said and to whom.
All right, well, I want to pick up then on that point with regards to corruption with Jonathan, because during her testimony, we heard time and time again Miss Ivanovich point out that her aim had always been to work on anti-corruption efforts, and that is why she believes she was targeted. You mentioned, Jonathan, that you've worked with her on such efforts. Tell me about her commitment to it.
Yeah. Well, look, there's no doubt. I mean, this is, again, Masha Ivanovich. I think the record in terms of her efforts to address corruption in Ukraine was exactly where the policy of the United States was, the policy of Germany, IMF, the EU. The United States has been part of an effort to support transformation in Ukraine, to address corruption, to strengthen its democracy. And Masha Ivanovich was a key component of U.S. policy, of engagement in Ukraine, and working both with civil society, working with government, and working with different sectors. And so anybody who claims that she wasn't doing anything but what the U.S. government was interested in doing, or that she wasn't committed to combating corruption, isn't telling the truth. And I do think there is some truth to the fact that certainly when the United States and others are engaged in addressing corruption in a place like Ukraine, there are certainly interests that are not going to be happy about that engagement.
I think certainly what is becoming very apparent during the course of these hearings is how important the use of language is. And to you, Nick, with that in mind, do you think that Ukrainians feel that their President Zelensky was involved in a tit-for-tat favour, a quid pro quo, or subject to bribery, as Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi branded it?
I think the reality is, if you speak to people here on the streets in Kiev, they are not following this, difficult as that might be to really believe it from the sort of Washington hothouse perspective. When you ask people what it is exactly that Trump was trying to get from Zelensky, most people are pretty much clueless. Only really the people who really are the news junkies are following this to any great detail. In normal circumstances, I think Ukrainians would expect their president to try and get as close as humanly possible to the leader of their most significant Western ally. But given the risks involved here, especially from the kind of expert analyst community, there's even a sense of kind of sympathy with Zelensky that he really is now between a rock and a hard place. Either he could investigate Hunter Biden, he could go along with that request, in which case he opens himself up to charges of meddling in US politics. If he doesn't, he has an unfriendly White House to fear. So this is really a lose-lose situation for him, and one he didn't want or expect to find himself in.
Jonathan, on that point, this allegation against the president is labelled, I mean, it could be bribery, extortion, abuse of power. Do you think that will define the success of this inquiry ultimately?
Well, I think the inquiry is still ongoing. It's pretty clear that there was a quid pro quo expected by President Trump. And I just say, in your last word as well, too, I mean, Ukraine is obviously being dragged through the mud through this process as well, which is damaging both for Ukraine but also for U.S. national security interests. Ukraine has been a priority, a bipartisan priority for both sides of the aisle in Washington. And I think the president's legacy is not only about whether it's bribery, whether he has committed this offense. It's about putting at risk U.S. national security interests and sort of in a way that he seeks to gain something back. And I think the biggest thing is that the president is the commander-in-chief of the United States. He is not supposed to be conducting business that benefits him politically. And so I think what comes next will bear out. I think there's enough information already laid out that has shown that the president has committed an impeachable act, and now Congress will have to decide.
But I want to ask you more about that, Jonathan, because as we know, whatever happens with this inquiry, impeachment has to follow through in the Senate, of course, Republican-controlled. Yeah. Now we have a fresh allegation of witness intimidation. Could we start to see those key Republicans peel away from the pack? What's your feeling there in Washington?
Well, I think these Republicans will have to listen to the information, listen to the witnesses. Right now, it seems like they're not going to break from the president in terms of support. I think in the back of their minds, there's obviously the upcoming presidential race. And so how they engage with the president and the president's supporters could impact themselves politically. We may not be at that breaking point yet, but the type of action that the president took today to intimidate a witness in a very public way, while the impeachment inquiry is happening, is damning. And I think the ultimate court of public opinion is going to be the American voters in 2020. And certainly a story of the president conducting the things and doing the things that he's doing is not going to be helpful for him in terms of re-election. And the American public certainly wants a commander-in-chief that is thinking about their national security interests over his own.
Nick, I want to just briefly broaden this out beyond the court of US public opinion, because this is, not just about an impeachment hearing in the US. I want to ask you about the global perspective. How do Ukrainians feel about their president being at the centre of a scandal, as well as the withdrawal of military assistance?
Well, there's obviously bemusement that suddenly Ukraine is on the front pages of all the US media. Lots of people are, as I mentioned, struggling to understand how it is quite that their country has reached this position. In terms of the military aid, especially here among those who follow politics more closely, among the elites, there is great worry that through Ukrainegate, the so-called Ukraine scandal, a slightly misleading name, an unfair term for Ukraine, that the brand of this country will become so toxic in Washington that bipartisan support for Ukraine that Jonathan was speaking about, that evaporates, especially at a time now where lots of European leaders are looking for rapprochement with Putin's Kremlin, maybe drawing back the sanctions that have been in place since Crimea and Donbass. So really at a time now where Ukraine needs American support more than ever, this could throw US policy towards Ukraine out of kilter for years to come. If, as it looks, there will be no investigation into Hunter Biden, that means that Zelensky and Ukraine face an unfriendly and unhappy White House for the next year and potentially even for a further term.
Jonathan Katz in Washington, I want to give you the last word, because as the former envoy was testifying, we did see then those tweets from the US president, and I wonder what's your reading there in the United States? Will it be more damaging, the president's retort on social media, or the very concerning testimony that was delivered by the former US ambassador today? What's your sense?
Well, I think that if you look at the polling numbers in the United States right now, there's a majority that supports this impeachment inquiry process. I think that the tweet today by the president, on one hand, will certainly highlight that the president is trying to intimidate a witness and to prevent others potentially from testifying against him, not only in this case, but in any other case that might come up against him. However, in the court of public opinion, there's certainly those in Washington that are going to be watching Fox News. Politically, they may associate with that and support the president, and those that will be supporting other or watching other news stations too that present a different perspective. I think ultimately, in the end, when you start to look at the polling numbers, when you start to look at how the American public is feeling about the upcoming election, these are very damaging moments for the president of the United States. And I think the court of public opinion, again, is going to play out over the next several months. And I don't think that the Democrats are calculating completely what this might mean for them politically. I think what the Democrats in Washington are trying to do now is to ensure that U.S. national security is protected and that the president does not use these same tactics going forward in this upcoming election. So I think there's some different calculus. Some of it is to prevent more activity like this from happening, but the other part is to hold the president accountable for something that may be criminal, impeachable, and we'll find out over the next couple of weeks where Congress goes and where the American public thinks this should go.
We certainly will. Jonathan Katz from the German Marshall Fund of the United States, as well as Nick Connolly, our correspondent in Kiev. Thanks to you both.